All right, so tonight's lecture, oops, you probably can't even see it. So let me go back here and share my screen. That's probably better. So we're going to talk about Chapter 8, and we're going to learn a little bit more about different types of statements, and then we'll have a very short presentation from the criminal investigation course on statements. But statements are they're super important as it relates to evidence, follow-up investigations, etc. And that's why they have kind of their own separate chapter. And it's good that you all learn who are these individuals that you're talking to and some ways to help you better communicate with them. Your writing assignment this week is basically going to be kind of an interview where they end up talking to an individual regarding a theft. And there's kind of an interesting dynamic in this week's writing assignment. Hopefully, write it just like it is, and we'll go over it. Don't get too tangled up in the Miranda part of it. But when you look at the scenario, you should at least think about, hey, this is interesting. Where does Miranda fit in? And again, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes when we get there. But what we want to do for Chapter 8 is really understand the difference between a reporting party, a victim, a witness, and a suspect. And it might seem simple, and sometimes these can overlap. So we do have to understand that. Your reporting party could also be the victim. The reporting party can be separate. Your witness could be the reporting party. So, there's a lot of different things. And on an occasion, your suspect could actually be the reporting party. So it's good to at least differentiate between who these individuals are and the fact that there could be a little bit of overlap. We want to understand the importance of identifying each person on scene. When you get to the scene of a crime scene or some type of report call, etc., and that person's role in regards to being a victim, a witness, or a suspect, because definitely how you handle them, how you talk to them, how you prepare to interview them or interrogate them is really going to depend on who they are. We definitely want to understand the importance of translating that interview or your interview notes into your report that others are going to be able to read and understand. And that, again, is tough. If you're like me, early in law enforcement, well, actually, even now, my handwriting is horrible. So when I went through the academy a million years ago, we basically had to block print everything. So that way the instructors could actually see what we were writing, because a lot of us had very kind of horrible handwriting. So typically that's why you see a lot of law enforcement officers print. They don't write in cursive. They typically print everything. And we want to understand, how to clarify what an interviewee is telling you during an interview. Don't just take everything for granted just based on what they say, because a lot of times you may need some follow-up questions. And so there are some strategies that you can implement in order to make sure that you're getting the right story. You don't just want to have somebody tell you something once and then take it as gospel and kind of go from there. You may want to wrap back around and clarify a few things. So with that said, keep in mind, law enforcement, we do spend a lot of time speaking to people. Besides writing, and again, on TV, all you see is the run and gun and arresting people and things like that. You really don't see the kind of mundane part of policing, which is a lot of times it's gathering information. It's speaking to witnesses, victims, and even your suspect involved, in whatever incident you're dealing with. And sometimes these interviews can be quick and simple, and a lot of times they can be very challenging and daunting, because your job, again, is to try to get the individual to talk and to tell you what happened. So that you develop a kind of a skill set after a while. What you don't want to do is maybe come off too strong initially and have the person shut down and not want to talk to you at all. And then you've lost your opportunity there to obtain some type of statement or rationale for whatever it is the person is being accused of. And having some basic interview guidelines can help simplify what you're going to do, along with some strategies on where to interview a person, and not just how, but even setting up the interview room, because there are different strategies. A lot of times, one-on-one interviews, we don't like to do a lot of one-on-one interviews. Certainly, if they're not being recorded, we want to make sure that we record and videotape everything with a one-on-one interview. Preferably, having another person in the room is good, not only to help you with questioning, but to maybe remind you of something and for safety, because we definitely want to keep safety in mind as we're interviewing individuals as well. But even strategically setting up your interview room is kind of an important task. So when we talk about involved parties, just kind of letting you know who these folks are, and sometimes there's a different name, as you see, like with the number 2 here, but the victim, that's the person injured or the person whom the crime is committed against. So, are there any instances where you could have 2 victims from the same crime? Could the person be a victim and could? So here, I'll go ahead, Dale.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
so
you can have. What's that?
No, go ahead. Keep talking.
I was going to say you can have 2 victims of the same crime, and you can have 2 suspects who are also victims. It happens.
Okay, so if we have a liquor store robbery, just kind of as an example, so you're the clerk, you're working at night, and somebody comes in with a firearm and points it at you and demands money and leaves the scene. Who is the victim of that particular incident?
The liquor store.
Yeah, so technically speaking, the liquor store is the actual victim, and you are going to be, as the one that had the firearm pointed at you, you could be listed as a victim as well. Some agencies might have both, but technically the liquor store is the victim and you are an involved party. You could be the reporting party, or you could be victim too. It just kind of depends on how your agency likes to write. Go ahead. I think I saw a hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was me. I was in the middle of making spaghetti. What I was trying to get to, or the point I was trying to get to, is that if you're in the commission of a crime and then a crime is done to you while you're committing the crime. So like if you're robbing the grocery store and the guy behind you was going to rob the grocery store and he gets upset that you're taking his money and he shoots you, the convenience store is a victim and you are a victim, but you're also a suspect.
I guess it could be that way. I'm not sure how they would really write it, but that would be kind of an interesting concept. But sure, I mean, we know that people have committed crimes and then been the victim of another person, so that is possible. But just note that the victim is typically the person, or if it's a business, but it's the person who is either injured or whom the crime is committed against. A complainant is the person who requests some action be taken, and a lot of times the complainant is referred to as the reporting party. Sometimes you might even hear RP for reporting party, so you might hear somebody refer to that individual as an RP. And a witness is a person who saw the crime or a part of it. They don't necessarily have to see the entire thing, but they might have seen part of it. They may have seen a person running out of the store. They may have seen a person getting into a vehicle and speeding away. So they didn't actually witness the whole thing, but maybe they witnessed part of it. And all of those things are really, really important. So don't discount your witnesses. So kind of a little bit deeper dive, the reporting party, that RP I talked about, is the person who contacted the law enforcement agency to report a crime or some other situation that they believe needs the involvement of law enforcement. And typically, again, a lot of times the person calling is a witness or even the victim. And see, so that's how we kind of get a little bit of overlap. But there could be three individuals. There could be a reporting party calling because they heard screaming in a, in a house next door to them. So they're the reporting party, and the victim could actually be the person in the house that the crime is being committed against. So they could be separate or they could be together, right? So we've got a little bit of overlap there. So just, kind of keep that in mind. And a lot of agencies, they have forms for these types of things, and you guys have been typing on them already. But remember, the reporting party may first start out as a victim or a witness. And sometimes after you get additional information, they might actually turn out to be involved. So that's why fact gathering and not taking the first statement from somebody is really, really important to be able to kind of dive down into a person's statement. When it comes to certain crimes, like even homicide or arson crimes, a lot of times you might have an arsonist that makes the call. If you have somebody that's going to, subject themselves to a suicide by cop, they may call in on themselves so that law enforcement responds to, to deal with them. So there are these different things that take place. The victim, this one is probably a little simpler because, again, this is the individual who has been wronged in a criminal matter by another. The wrong is committed is defined as a crime by statutory law. Statutory law stipulates the elements of each crime. And these statutory elements, which mean written statutory, okay, must be present to arrest and charge a person for a particular crime. So remember, as you're writing your reports, make sure that you're writing in a way that you can meet the elements if all the information is there. Okay. So regardless of the type of crime, and the example here is an ATM robbery, you have to meet the elements. So that should help you a little bit when you deal with questioning. And a couple of weeks from now, we're going to do some robbery reports. So if we look at the code section, and that's another reason that a lot of times on your writing assignments, I'll put the code in there for you to click on and be able to look at, so you know exactly what robbery is. So you don't get mixed up like the average individual. A lot of times we get phone calls, hey, I've been robbed, and it's actually a burglary. So because people just assume that robbery is taking your stuff from your house, but a lot of times it's not. So here's what you have to look at. So if you're going to prove this code section, 211 of the California Penal Code, which is robbery, you have to meet the kind of the highlighted, the bold words right here. So it has to be the felonious taking of personal property in the possession of another from that person or their immediate presence, and the big thing, against their will, accomplished by force or fear. So if you don't meet all of these, then you're not going to have a robbery. You might have something else. You might have a theft. You might have, a burglary, etc. But you're not going to have a robbery if you don't meet all the elements. So that should really help you with your questioning. So, and a primary example that I can kind of throw out there is if any of you work security, and let's say that somebody goes into, where did I shop at recently? Target. So someone goes into Target and they grab a bunch of stuff and they run out the store, and the security officers chase them out. The person jumps into the car and takes off. Just based on that scenario that I gave you, did we meet the section for robbery? Yeah, we're kind of missing it, right? We're missing the big part, kind of this part down here at the bottom. There's no force or fear. What about if the Target personnel saw the person before they were leaving the store, tried to grab them, and as they grabbed them, the person punches the store security officer, pulls out a gun and points it at him, and then runs out of the store with the property? Have we met it now? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So we kind of stepped up a little bit and now we've met that. So you have to be able to articulate what crime you have, and then you have to write toward that, if that makes any sense. So it's important. Same with burglary. And there's a lot that goes into burglary, so I kind of cut the section down a little bit. But, it's Penal Code 459. Every person, that's pretty easy. So that's anybody who enters a house, room, apartment, and there's a laundry list of places that they can go into. But here's the big part that you have to show in order to prove this, which means that you're going to have to write it with intent to commit grand or petty theft or petty larceny, same thing, or any other felony. So if you can't show that their intent was to do this, you're not going to make burglary. You might have a theft or something else, but you're not going to get the section of burglary. So that's the important part when you're talking to victims and witnesses. If you're going to establish a crime, you need to know what the elements of the crime are in order to write toward that and make it so, if that kind of makes any sense. Any question on crime and elements or what have you?
Yes, sir. What happens if the person that's committing the burglary is caught with possessions that don't belong to him in his hands? Would that not be enough to show intent?
Oh, absolutely. And for burglary, honestly, you could actually prove a burglary without them even taking anything, as long as you could show their intent was to go inside and commit petty theft or larceny. So here's an example. If somebody broke into a home in the middle of the night and they had flashlights, or let's say that there's two of them, this is probably easier. Two people break into a house in the middle of the night, they force open the door. Can we show intent to go inside because they had to force the door open?
Yes.
Yeah, so you have to write it towards that. So if you don't put the part that there was forced entry or damage to the door, you're going to lose part of your proving intent. And then when
I
you
see.
yeah, and then when they get inside, if they have, if they're stacking property next to the door or something like that, can that show intent?
Yes.
Sure. So there's a lot of other things that we can do to show intent other than the fact that they had the property with them. So this is why it's really important for, witness interviews, and suspect interviews, and really taking a good look at your crime scene to make sure that you can establish your intent. So there's a lot of ways to do that. So that's actually a really good question. Okay. So again, when you interview a victim or a witness, give the person, kind of a chance to first explain what happened, so that you're able to first kind of determine if there was any crime. You don't want to jump the gun and say, that somebody's, kind of blurts out a statement and right away, oh, okay, that's a robbery. Well, you need to make sure that you have the elements. So let the person kind of run through it one time. Give them a chance to explain what happened so you're able to determine the crime type. Sometimes there is no crime. It may just be, they might be casing some location and maybe they didn't get inside, so you may not be able to establish that crime. Go ahead, Dale.
Is that why you would want to interview and re-interview the suspect to see if like the story changes here and there enough to catch him with burglary or to see if there really was a crime?
Yeah, it's always good, even for a victim or a witness. A lot of times it's good to let them kind of get it out. Don't let them drone on for hours and things like that, but you may want them to for a witness and a victim, you want to at least first establish that there was a crime. With the suspect, it's definitely important to develop a rapport with that person, just like with a victim or a witness, and let them kind of talk for a minute. And for victim and witnesses, it's always better just to kind of let them say, you ask them, hey, tell me what happened, and let them kind of give you a 3 or 4 minute rundown. And then you can go back and then you can kind of, clarify a lot of those statements. And Dale, that would be the same thing if we were talking about a suspect. Yeah, you're going to want to let them make a general statement, and then you're going to kind of hone in, if you will, focus in on some of those more critical things. Go ahead, Wayne. I see your hand.
What happens if a spouse had a restraining order on the other spouse, and the husband comes back into the home because he has the key and the locks haven't changed, and then the wife says, he took things. Is that just on the restraining order, or would that be considered a robbery?
No, that would be a violation of the restraining order if he went inside, and then it's a civil matter as it kind of relates to the property, because the property is going to be something that's going to have to be dealt with through the courts. So it wouldn't be a robbery, and it probably wouldn't even be a burglary. But it definitely would be a violation of a restraining order.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So again, remember we're kind of still on the victim and witness part. Super important, especially dealing with a victim and a witness. Develop that rapport first with the victim or witness before attempting to record anything. Don't just, walk right up to the person, whip out your steno pad or your folder or whatever you're going to use to write with and start writing things down. Give them a chance to kind of air it out for a second. Okay. And remember, too, that these folks aren't having a great day. Especially, if you're a witness, it's probably a little less disturbing, but if you're a victim of a crime, it can be a little bit upsetting depending upon the crime type. If you were a clerk at a fast food store or a liquor store or some type, anything else, even a bank teller, and somebody passes you a note at the bank saying this is a robbery or I have a bomb or whatever, or they point a gun at you, you're going to get shaken up. And a little more than you think. So you want to give them some time to kind of relax a little bit, knowing that they're going to be a little bit stressed, and you don't want to just jump right into give me the facts, just the facts, tell me what happened, etc. So you want them to get a moment. Prior to your interview, and we're still talking about victims and witnesses for the most part, make sure that your scene is safe. And do what you can to make the victim feel safe and comfortable. So if they need to sit down, do that. And scene safety is really important, you guys, because a lot of times, sometimes the suspect is around there. And especially it's more important if you're actually interviewing or interrogating a suspect, but you still want to have scene safety so everybody feels comfortable, etc. And once that scene is secure and the victim can is ready to talk, etc. If you give them some water or let them sit down or something like that, then you can start the interview. And again, it's a great idea to separate victims, witnesses, and suspects. And the reason is that you don't want them to compare stories. It's not to be mean or anything like that, but you really don't want them comparing stories, especially when it comes to what a person might look like, what a car might look like, etc., because they'll start to kind of listen to each other, and before you know it, they'll all agree that the car was blue when actually maybe two or three of them thought the car was black. So it's important that you do that. Yes, question.
Yeah, no, Spivak said in one of his classes that was considered witness contamination, and you have to be careful because one witness is always going to have a stronger personality than the others, and if they can hear him talk, they might change their story or their statement to fit that person's statement because of the way the guy talked.
Yeah, I mean, in anything else, it's if you put five people in a room and they're going to do some kind of an exercise or a project or something, there's always going to be one or two of those folks that are a little bit more outgoing, that are going to want to kind of take the reins and run with it or what have you. So it's no different when it comes to dealing with victims or multiple victims and witnesses, more so with witnesses. But you want to separate them exactly as much as you can, so they don't talk to each other. The only time that you may want to keep suspects together, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in just a minute, is perhaps if you're going to put them in an interview room together or in the back of the police car together where you want them to start talking to each other. And a lot of times we might do that to see if they start to prepare a story. So you could record in the back of a police car. There's no expectation of privacy there. So if you put two suspects in there, a lot of time, and then you shut the door and you walk away for a minute, you'd be surprised they might start talking to each other, saying, "Hey, don't tell them what happened. Hey, don't," and they'll start to get a story. Same with an interview room. You put two suspects that committed a crime in an interview room, a lot of times they'll do that as well. But you have to pick and choose. You have to be careful on that. But a lot of times that would be the only time that I would really suggest that you do that. Otherwise, you want to keep people separate so you don't taint anybody's statement, etc. So you may want to begin, like I said earlier, with a kind of a non-threatening approach. And you want to have that approach anyway with any victim or witness. And the best way, like I said, is to start an interview is to kind of ask something open-ended. Like, tell me what happened. And that doesn't mean you're going to let them drone on for 30 minutes, but you just want them to kind of get it off their chest for a second. And you don't even have to start writing anything down yet. You can make some eye contact. You can, make sure that they know that you're paying attention to them and that you care. And then you can wrap back around. And you can go from there. So I would take that approach. And Marcy, I see your chat. Would you ever put two people from two different situations in the same car? No, you really do want to keep people separate. Again, I would only, if you're only looking for, suspects to talk to each other to formulate whatever their defense is going to be, you could do that. But other than that, I would keep everybody separate. So again, this open-ended thing really will help the person feel a little bit more at ease and kind of start that communication process. And during your initial interview stage, be a good listener, you guys. Okay? Use your nonverbal skills to keep the interview going. Don't sit like this, and I'm not sure if you can see me or not. You probably can. With your hands like this or like this, like you're not interested. Certainly don't sit back and cross your arms because that really shows that you're not really interested in what the person is going to say. You want to be attentive, okay? And now would be the time as you kind of come back around after they gave you their initial, hey, here's what happened. Now you could take out that notebook, your notepad, what have you, and then you could start taking notes. But just that initial thing, again, you may want to not take notes until they've gone through their first statement. Now, that's not always going to be the case. This is kind of, if everything was perfect, you would let them talk first, and then you could go back around, sit them down, give them some water, and then you could actually start taking notes. But there are times where you may want to take notes right away. And especially if you have a crime that just occurred and the suspects have just fled, you want to get whatever car they're in, what they look like, what they were armed with, etc., out as quickly as possible. So you may have to ask for some information very quickly up front in order to give that initial, hey, here's what happened, and then you could go back later and follow up with the rest of the interview. So a lot of this might kind of be common sense. As far as, again, when you come back around on the second time, the recording and documentation stage, that's kind of your next step. So this is where you would ask the person, okay, so let's go over this now. And then you could have them repeat certain things that maybe you need some more clarification on. And you'll be taking notes. And again, if you can take notes and you can write shorthand and you can remember what you wrote, then that's great. If you can't read your own writing, make sure that you spell things all the way out. If you're like me, I have atrocious handwriting. I have to write in block letters. I don't abbreviate because sometimes I couldn't remember what it was that I abbreviated. So I would tend to spell things out unless it's something simple, like, if you were going to abbreviate, phencyclidine for PCP. Okay, that's pretty simple. Even I can remember that. But anything different, you really want to make sure that you are very clear in your notes. Keep your victim, on track. Keep them focused. Don't let them kind of, go too far off into left or right field, but try to keep them on track by asking the right questions. Okay. And then go ahead. I see a hand.
Yeah, so would you add like levity to the situation to kind of keep the suspect more at ease and open into divulging more information?
I would be careful with levity. A lot of us try to use a little bit of levity, but remember, and you're talking about a suspect or a victim or a witness?
A suspect.
So yeah, so I mean, it wouldn't be the first time where I've maybe used just a tad on a suspect, but be very, very careful in kind of downplaying something like that. I've told suspects, hey, I understand where you're coming from, or said something like that, but levity is difficult, you guys, especially with a victim or a witness. So you do want to be careful. You don't want to crack jokes or things like that. Again, remember they're having a really horrible day because they were victimized or something similar. So just kind of keep that in mind, but that is a good question. And so your final stage in your interview process, again, is as you're taking notes and things like that, is again your clarification stage. And this is where you're going to start to ask very specific questions. Okay. And in this stage right here, you need to communicate exactly what you're looking for in order to finish up your interview. So if you need to get very direct, then you can go ahead and do that. This is definitely a lot easier with a victim or a witness, depending upon the crime type. Okay. If the person is a sexual assault victim, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And that's why you have to, again, you need to give the person a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to interviewing them and things like that. A lot of times, again, that's why I always suggest that it's important that you have an additional person with you. If you're dealing with a suspect, and we're going to get into that next, you may want to pre-write your questions. You don't really have to do that as much with a victim or a witness, but definitely with a suspect, you want to interview your victim witnesses first and then turn your interview or your interrogation to the suspect. And you may want to pre-write those questions so you don't forget some things, and you want a little bit more detail. Okay. Allow the victim to explain the reported crime first. We talked about that. Again, kind of summarizing, have the victim repeat the statement a second time. And, when they do that second time, that's when you can kind of take notes. And again, it's not always perfect. You may take notes the very first time they give you a statement, and that may just be the way it is. If you're talking to somebody in the field, if you have a chance to take a victim or a witness to the station, then you're going to have a little bit more opportunity to take a little bit more time. And I'm not really going to show you the sample notes from your textbook because I think you guys know what notes look like. Keep in mind, though, again, as you translate your notes, you have to be able to translate those notes that you take, your interview notes, to your report, which is why a couple of times we've done those note-taking exercises on discussion days to get you used to kind of watching something and jotting something down and being able to actually read what you wrote down and then turn that into an actual police report. So when you transcribe your notes into the report, again, it's important to be accurate. So be careful with abbreviations. Don't assume that the spelling of something, especially a street name or somebody's first name or even their last name, that you know exactly how to spell it, because it may be spelled a different way. So with names, street names, be very specific and ask. If you're not sure, ask, okay? I don't know if I would consider, so I'm in the chat looking right now. I'm not sure if I would consider notes a mini report, but let me ask you, are your notes discoverable? Could somebody subpoena your notes to court? The answer is yes. I see a lot of head nodding, so that's good. So yes, that's why it's important that, the only thing that should be in your notebook are notes, not information about somebody you went out with or little scribbling drawings that you do or different things like that, because those are discoverable if you still have them. Okay, so you want to make sure that, the only things that you want to be professional. So only put in there what you don't mind everybody else looking at, because you definitely need to know that that stuff can actually get out. All right. Good question, though. Okay, so regardless of when the information was told during the interview, remember that your report should tell the story chronologically. So put that information where it belongs in the story, not necessarily where it was told. Maybe you are interviewing people out of order. Maybe you talk to a witness before you, or your victim before you talk to a witness, or this person, that person. Just make sure that that your report goes chronological, because it's easier to read. Because remember, in your report, you might say victim 1, victim 2, witness 1, witness 2. So that's okay. So we're going to know who you're talking about. Also, from this last week's writing assignment, remember not to call your, a suspect, a victim, or even a witness. You don't have to use their you shouldn't use their first name unless you're going to, the very first time you use their name, you could use their full name. It could be suspect John Jones. After that, it should just be suspect Jones, not John. So I saw a couple of those. So remember, you're not on, first buddy terms with a lot of these people. So calling them by their first name really isn't something that you want to do. So it's their last name. Okay. And that way you can keep things very, very consistent by doing that. Okay, when you talk about interviewing, and I'm not going to take the time to watch the videos, but remember, when you interview people, especially when you interrogate them, we have to stay within the rules, the confines of the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, etc. So we don't do things that you might see on TV. Okay, so no, we don't waterboard people. No, it's not like the movie Taken, where we can electrocute somebody in order to get a statement, although that is one of the best video clips that I've seen in a movie. That's something that we typically don't do. Okay. Does that mean that you can never raise your voice in an interview? No, but you just have to be very specific and have a rationale for why you may doing it, or why you are doing it. And then as we kind of get to the second half of the lecture, consider how you may talk to individuals. So here's kind of what I mean before we get into the suspect. If you were to interview, let's say, a child molester, would you want to be up in their face screaming and cussing at them? Okay, so Scott, you say no. How come?
Trying to articulate this properly. They're more likely to be a cowardly person to begin with, being that that's what they choose to do as a crime commission. So being that intimidating is only going to help them or make them lock up and not talk to you.
No, that's really good. And remember, certain individuals that commit certain crimes are master manipulators. And you're right. A lot of times, the softer approach, as disgusting as it might sound, sitting closer to that person instead of further apart, making eye contact and really looking like you understand is going to get you a lot further. Maybe even saying something like, yeah, I really understand. Tell me more. Even though that's disgusting as heck. These are things that, are important for us to remember, these different techniques. So you are correct. You don't want to just jump on somebody and come off a little bit too brash, because they are going to kind of lock up. So you're right. In the chat, I'm looking, they're more likely to remain quiet. And that is definitely true. Individuals are. So as we turn the conversation more towards the suspects, okay, when you are interviewing, or more aptly put, interrogating potential suspects, you still want to begin that process in a non-threatening manner, because your goal here is to get a statement from the person that will help you meet the elements of the crime that you're trying to document. And the only way you're going to get a statement usually is if you kind of take the non-threatening approach. It never hurts to try that first. It doesn't mean that you can raise the level of intensity a little bit later, but initially you want to start off with that non-threatening approach, okay? And that really will help you later on down the line, trust me. And when you talk about the different types of questioning, remember there are different types of questions. And we have the direct, the indirect, the closed-ended, the open-ended, and we have leading questions. And we kind of need to know what these are, because we want to know the style of question, or the type of question, depending upon the person that we're dealing with, or how much information we want to get out of them. So remember, direct questions are just kind of what it says, very to the point, okay? Very little possibility of misinterpretation. So an example of a direct question could be, what time did you leave for the restaurant? It's pretty specific, because you're looking for a time. And if they were to say, well, I'm really not sure, you may have to do a follow-up question. Well, what time do you think it was, or what have you? So if you're trying to lock them in. So that's a direct question, something very much to the point. An indirect question would be kind of a more polite way to ask. It's a little less forward, but it is meant to elicit kind of a variety of responses, right? Or a little bit more. So the example could be, how do you and your neighbor get along? And yeah, sure, somebody might just say, well, good. And you could have them elaborate a little bit more. But typically they might tell you a little bit more, because it's pretty open, right? It's not super open-ended, but it is meant to elicit a variety of responses from an individual. So that's kind of an indirect question. A closed-ended question requires kind of a yes or no, or a really short response. So you could change that from how do you and your neighbor get along, which is kind of, asking for a variety of, or you could get a variety of responses, to do you get along with your neighbor? And it could be yes or no. And then you could say, well, why not? I mean, so so it's more of a yes or no, or a very short. Did you go straight home after work? Yes or no. So those are kind of closed-in questions. Open-ended are meant to elicit longer, more detailed responses. Kind of what you're looking for is some insight into the person's knowledge or feelings, right? So, you could use why or how or tell me to kind of start your question. So an example could be, what can you tell me about your relationship with your neighbor? And that should trigger them to kind of talk a little bit more. And that still doesn't mean that you couldn't kind of focus in with a couple of direct questions after that, but here you want the person to tell you a little bit more. You want some personal knowledge. And then finally, we have leading questions, and we have to be careful about leading questions. And that's one of the really important factors when it comes to asking questions, is you don't want to lead somebody or give them the answer. Okay. So a leading question is one that basically prompts a person to a specific response, and a lot of times it kind of implies the answer. So the example here is, was the suspect wearing a black jacket? Well, you're kind of leading the person to say, sure, yes, they were wearing a black jacket, because you're telling them what the color is already. So A better way to put that would be maybe two questions. What was the person wearing? And if they said he was wearing a jacket, you could say, or at least at the very least, what color was the jacket? Instead of, was he wearing a black jacket? Because you don't want to give them the answer. So these are important things to know about questions. Remember, you're going to have an opportunity to interview a suspect involved in all different types of crimes. Okay, it's not just burglaries and robberies. It's going to be a bunch of different things. It's important to remember there's a difference between an interview and an interrogation. Okay, an interview is typically with a witness, a victim, an RP, etc. An interrogation is a little bit more accusatory, right? It's usually geared more towards a suspect. But also understand that an interview can turn into an interrogation, right? You might be interviewing somebody you believe is a involved party or a witness, and it turns out, wow, based on the info I'm getting, this person might actually be involved. So, and that happens too. So just know that an interview can actually turn into an interrogation. Okay. So some basics with an interview, the person's free to leave if they choose to. Okay. Interviews, again, are usually with victims, witnesses, reporting parties, etc. With an interrogation, that person is usually not free to leave. Okay, because you are asking accusatory questions. And interrogations are usually, again, with suspects that are involved in crimes. So that's one easy way to kind of remember that. Now, it's not always 100%. Remember, an interview can start off as an interview and turn into an interrogation. Could an interrogation actually show that a person was not involved in a crime? Yeah, it could kind of go back the other way a little bit too, but an interrogation really is more accusatory, okay? And then finally, when you talk about interviewing, let's not forget the Miranda part, okay? Upon receiving incriminating information, you really should stop an interview and advise a person of their Miranda rights, okay? And a lot of times when you're doing an interrogation, you may want to Mirandize that person before you do the interrogation. Now, determining when to provide Miranda is really one of the biggest variables when you are talking to a person. A lot of times, as far as actually giving the admonishment, there are two different ways that I've seen law enforcement officers do this, or agencies have you do this. One is by a Miranda card, and I'll show you what a card looks like, and the other is by a written form. Okay, and this is what a Miranda card looks like. And again, the basics for Miranda, really two things to remember: custody and interrogation. If you're missing one of those, technically you don't have to Mirandize somebody, but you could if you wanted to just, be safe. All right. Custody, they're not free to leave, and interrogation. And this is what the Miranda warning is. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Sometimes, if you look at 5 different Miranda cards, they might be skewed just a little bit. They might not be all exactly the same. But as long as they kind of, they get all that information out there that the court is looking for, then you're okay. In the olden days, we used to try to memorize this. And the problem with memorizing it is if you had to go to court and the defense attorney asked you, hey, Officer Farrar, did you advise my client of his Miranda rights? Why, yes, I did. Could you tell me what you told him? And then you're thinking, oh, dang. And you have to remember what you said. Hopefully you wrote it in your report. But somebody got smart somewhere in here and said, you know what? Instead of doing it from memory, let's carry a card. And here's what you have to read the person. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right, at this time to talk to an attorney or a lawyer. Again, it doesn't matter which word you use as long as you're getting the factual information out. And to have the attorney present with you while you're being questioned. If you cannot afford to hire an attorney, one will be appointed to represent you free of charge before questioning if you wish. You can decide at any time to exercise these rights and not answer any questions. And kind of a new thing was added to these cards. And you can see the questions here. Do you understand each of these rights? And the reason for that is to make sure that the person understands 1 through 5. Because if they don't, you want to make sure that they do. And then the second question is, having all these, these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to me now? So it's important that you understand that. And again, the cards aren't going to be, they might have a word different or, here or there, but as long as it gets the information across, it's fine. Now, also, you could write in your report, and this is another good thing for having a card, I advised suspect Jones of his Miranda rights per a department-issued Miranda card. Then you don't have to write all of this in your report. Why? Because it's on the card. So if you went to court, what would you bring with you? You'd bring the card. So that way, if the attorney said, did you read my client his rights? Yes, I did. What did you tell him? Well, I read it per a department-issued card. And I have that card with me right here. And if the court wants you to read it, fine. But typically they don't because it's on the card. So that's a Miranda card. The other thing is by a form. Okay. And hopefully you can see the form. I know it's a little bit small, but it's the same thing. It's got the Miranda warning. Okay. It's got a witnessing officer, your signature, the person that you advised of their rights. And so they're signing the form basically saying that I've read this, you read me my rights. And we also have something interesting now, of course, because technology is so big, we have body cameras. So you could also advise somebody of their rights. If you do it in an interview room, it's going to be recorded. If you do it in the field by chance, it's going to be recorded as well. So we have a lot of different ways of doing this. But again, remember, these are the two big pieces when it comes to Miranda: custody and interrogation. Okay, so as we kind of finish up, still on the theme of suspect statements, remember the same interview principles apply to suspects as those that are victims, witnesses, reporting parties, etc. The one major difference really is in interviewing a suspect or interrogating a suspect, always interview an individual from a position of safety. Okay, and you can see a couple of pictures I have here where this detective is showing a person a firearm inside of a bag. I wouldn't suggest doing that. Now I'm sure it's unloaded, but that's still to me a little bit too close. Here's a photo of somebody where a suspect kind of goes across the table and you can see that he's grabbing the officer's gun. So a lot of times when you're in an interview room, you're going to put your firearm somewhere else. You're going to secure it in a locker before you go in to interview someone. And you're going to, again, have two people in an interview room. Make sure that the person's been thoroughly searched and all of those things. If you need to have the person handcuffed or secured still, then you can go ahead and do that. You can still secure an individual and do an interview. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Again, some critical elements of Miranda. Make sure that it was properly given, and are they willing to, give a statement having understood the warning? Because remember, when they're going to give up their rights, if they're going to give you a statement, aren't they basically going to incriminate themselves? So that's why it's important that, do you understand all of these rights that I've explained to you? And having said that, if they say yes, then you ask them again, are you willing to talk to me right now about the incident that we're investigating, etc. So those are really important. As it relates to suspects, again, sometimes an effective way to establish rapport is to kind of downplay the crime. Don't make fun of it. You don't have to use levity, as kind of mentioned before, but you are allowed to downplay things a little bit. And I mean that by, yeah, I understand, why you might have robbed that person. I know that maybe you need some money because you needed to, feed your family, or I know you have a drug habit. That's kind of downplaying a little bit, even though it was an armed robbery, right? Again, be aware of your body language. Don't be judgmental. Don't just jump right off and start, putting a person in a category of whatever. You have to try to establish that rapport. Your goal here, as much as you may not like it, is to get the person comfortable and willing to talk to you. And that's really the whole goal, because you want to be able to establish the crime. Be aware of the person, the suspect's body language, okay? Their movements. Are they nervous? Are they kind of twiddling their fingers? Are they rubbing their hands together? Okay. I always found it interesting where you could put something on the table, something small, and see if they start fidgeting with it, because that just shows that they're nervous. Yes, question.
Yes, is body language interpretation admissible in court?
Sometimes. I mean, you can basically say that the person appeared to be nervous based on my observations, and then you have to explain your observations. So at that point, yes, sweating, wiping their eyebrows, rubbing their face, all those types of things, I would totally document. And the good part is, if your interview room has video, then the jury is going to be able to see all of those things that you documented. So that is important. So yes, a lot of times it is. So their movements, their gestures, their facial expressions, like did they look surprised? Were their eyes starting to tear up? And that's important, again, to watch body language, because you can tell right away. Like this picture, this guy right here, he doesn't want to talk to you, at least not right now, because he's kind of locked up, right? This officer's trying to talk, and this guy is kind of putting up the wall. But if you can see that their eyes are getting a little bit red and a little bit watery, that might be a sign that maybe you're getting closer to having this person talk to you, or you're on the right track based on a couple of questions that you asked, because they're starting to feel sad, etc. So facial expressions are really big. Eye contact is important. A lot of times when people won't make eye contact, it doesn't mean they are guilty, but could that be a sign that they might be they might be a little guilty and they don't want to look at you? Or they look straight down at the floor? Yeah, I mean, so that's another thing to really start thinking about. Their tone of voice. If they're amped up, is their voice high? Is it low? All of these things are important for you to be aware of. And especially if you're going to do a one-on-one interview. Again, I would always suggest two, but if you're going to do one-on-one, body language is important for your own safety if the person isn't secured. So again, these are really important things. Listen carefully to what the person has to say. Don't interrupt them and get all upset, etc. So make sure that you're really taking the time and listening to the person. It's super important that you do this. Your focus should be on the suspect's statements and his demeanor. So be a good listener. Let them talk. Let them drone on, because you never know what they might actually end up saying, and then you can follow up, okay? With that said, though, be in control of your interrogation. Don't let the person take control. You take control, okay? You may even want to find out before you do your interrogation what the suspect might kind of either fear most, and even kind of look at exploiting that a little bit. And I don't mean like aggressively, okay? What I mean is that if the suspect committed some type of crime and maybe his spouse doesn't know that he's involved in that, you may want to use that to basically get your interrogation going, and saying, I understand, I know it could be tough, you don't want someone else to find out, I'll do my best to not let them know, but I need you to tell me what's going on. So you could kind of tweak that around a little bit, if that makes any sense, and use that to your advantage, okay? And then once you have all of the information that you need, would be the time that you would go ahead and basically conclude your interview. So really important to understand you know, that the statement is going to help your report. So as it relates to your report, again, be cognizant of getting direct quotes of anything regarding an element of the crime, an incriminating statement, an admission of guilt, or a waiver of medical attention, etc. You don't have to quote too much in a report, but remember, quotes are good for those really important things. So if somebody appears to be injured and they're going to waive medical attention, that would be something that you may want to quote, because that's going to be an important thing. Or I fired the gun, or I shot the guy, or I did. Those are things that you want to get in a quote, or some type of threat. You don't have to quote everything that a person says, especially if it's already being recorded. You still want to quote those kind of high dollar statements, if you will, right? So anything that establishes the element of the crime, that incriminates the person, an admission of guilt, or a waiver of medical attention. Those are good things to quote. And in some instances, you could consider having the person write a statement. I've seen a lot of individuals where they'll, be interrogating a person and they'll have them write out a confession or write out a statement. That's okay, but you still want to go through the kind of the whole thing as far as interrogating and asking your own questions. Because if you have somebody write out a statement, that's still good, but it may have a lot of holes in it. It may not hit every question that you want, right, that you wanted to ask. So just kind of keep that in mind. So some tips as we finish up: place yourself again in a position of safety. Always separate your witnesses and your victims as quickly as possible. Okay. Always attempt to develop that rapport with an individual prior to documenting any information. Don't forget to ask open-ended questions. That's not a bad idea. And then you can always turn back around and focus in on more detailed questions. During the question and answer phase, remember to clarify a person's statements and review those significant factors. Listen really well, observe nonverbal communication, and you can have somebody write out a statement, but you may have to follow up with some more direct questions after that. Yes, question I see.
Okay, so I understand that, like, during an interview, you would generally not have to put yourself in a position of safety to be afraid of the witness. But what happens if you're getting a witness statement and the witness turns into your suspect? How
Well,
do you proceed then?
Well, and that's why you really want to always make sure that you are in a position of safety. And it doesn't mean that you secure your witness by, detaining them or anything, kind of over the top like that. But what you definitely want to do is you want to make sure that you are paying attention. You have good situational awareness, that the scene that you're dealing with is secure. Okay. And that's super important that you do that. And if you're standing talking to someone, a lot of times you'll see the officers stand kind of at an angle. They're not standing flat-footed facing towards a person, so you can't get pushed over. They kind of got that little V stance, if you will, with one foot kind of in front of the other as they're talking to someone. So my suggestion would be, again, that you're not going to treat a victim like a suspect, but you don't want to drop your guard either, if that makes any sense. But you don't want to be too paranoid. So it's kind of a judgment call, but just be aware that, yes, somebody that you're talking to could actually turn into someone involved in that particular crime. Okay, so I just want to finish up with this week's writing assignment. I'm not going to go through the other, I have the other short lecture, but I think that what we talked about tonight really covers everything that we need to go over. That little PowerPoint is also in the module if you want to take a look at it as well. But I wanted to really hit this week's assignment. And so our scenario for this week is going to be a supplemental report, and you've done these, and this is going to be the last sup that we're going to do, because when we come back, we're going to write some affidavits for a search warrant. We're going to do some robbery cases and some things a little higher up. We're going to do a domestic violence case. So now we're going to start to ramp up. Okay. So this is going to be the last one of these, but this one is interesting, and interesting in the aspect of Miranda. Okay. Because here, these two detectives have a suspect in a conspiracy to commit burglary, and they do have probable cause to arrest her. But they also discuss that if arrested, the suspect more than likely would not talk to them without an attorney. And the detectives want a statement from this person to strengthen their case, right? So they decide to attempt an interview with the suspect at her house. And the detectives decide not to tell her that they plan to arrest her until after she answers the questions. And the questions kind of lead to the admission the detectives are looking for, and they end up arresting her. And the suspect basically tells the detectives that if she knew that they had planned to arrest her, that they would not have talked to them without an attorney. So I want you to kind of think about that. I still want you to write the report as if you normally would. Okay, you use the video as the basis, you use the headings, and because this is kind of our last supplemental report, I'm really looking for you to be articulate. Okay, make sure you kind of cover all of the bases in there, but it is just a supplemental. You don't need a probable cause form. You don't need any citations. You don't need any of that stuff. I just want you to do the best job you can on a supplemental report. But kind of, again, think about the issue relating to this particular case, because we're going to have a little discussion about it when we come back after the break, the spring break. We'll come back, and when we kind of get back going, we're going to review this, because this is super interesting on whether or not this is something that the officers should actually be doing or not. And I'll let you kind of stew on that for a while. So with that said, that's going to kind of wrap up our lecture. We've already kind of gone over the assignment. Over spring break, I do plan on picking one night to where if you want to log in and talk a little bit about your final writing project, we can do that. We can go over that. There are no office hours next week. It's just going to be that one time where if you want to, you can log in, and I'll send it out probably in the next day or so on when that's going to be. It's not mandatory, but if you want to talk a little bit more about your final writing assignment, the homicide report, we can do that. Other than that, that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Let me stop sharing. Don't go anywhere yet, so I can actually kind of take roll here really quick. And this way I can get everybody's names on who showed up here on the bottom part of the screen. Any question on tonight's lecture? Okay, then so make sure that you get everything done this week, because the week after, I think it's Monday, is the 28th, if I'm trying to think right. That starts our kind of online spring break thing. So there will be no assignments, no class, no office hours during that week, but I will pick one night to where we can pop in really quick for just a few minutes, and if anybody wants to, and we can talk a little bit about the writing assignment. But if no one has any questions, that's going to wrap us up for this week, and you're all done.